Hi, I'm Dharanaba Nilananda, also known as the Monk Dude, and today I'm being interviewed by my friend Devashish Acosta, who is actually my editor, and he's going to be talking to me about my novel, which, well, I'll let him tell you all about that. I just wanted to make sure you know who he is, because you probably know me if you follow my blog, but you might not know Devashish yet. You soon will.
Well, Dada, thanks for inviting me here for this little literary hangout. I'll start off by reading a short description of the book, which actually can be found on the back cover. So in book 1 of the Microvita Tree, the intrepid Dr. Dogalog travels to Earth in the 14th century to recover the last remaining seed of the Microvita Tree in the long submerged ruins of Atlantis. If he can find the seed and replant it, this magical tree, when it blossoms, will release a flood of spiritual energy that will transform the planet, ushering in a golden age of enlightened consciousness. But the only ones who know how to find Atlantis are Nefarious, the evil wizard, and Joe, the most fearsome dragon in the universe. So I think I'd like to start out with just your reaction to some of the reviews you've gotten so far. And from what some of the ones I've read here, we've seen a little bit of mixed reviews. One glowing review from Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And Mr. Adams says, if I was still alive, this is the book I would love to have written. So, very nice. And however, William Shakespeare says they'll publish anything these days. So what do you think about the reviews you've gotten so far? How's the reaction to the book been?
Well, of course, if you're going to have reviews, they should be from famous people, even if they're not alive anymore. So yeah, we had a bit of fun making those ones up and attributing them to some of our favorite dead authors. Douglas Adams, of course, I'm a big fan of his writing, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. And, I guess the reason that we chose him and some of those others to pick on was because I'd kind of like to be able to write like them. I don't suppose I ever will, but I could try.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Douglas Adams one of your main inspirations for writing this type of comic fantasy?
Absolutely. I mean, this genre of comedy sort of mixed with, well, he was more of a science fiction writer, but fantasy or science fiction it's fairly sparsely populated. There aren't that many funny books in these genres, and he's certainly one of the great lights of comic science fiction. So he was a big inspiration.
Okay. So why don't we get a little bit into the genesis of the book. So let me just explain for your readers. They've probably seen your picture, whether on the website or on the book. So they may have realized by now that you are a monk. In fact, you are the Monk Dude. So you're a yogic monk. You've spent the last basically 30 plus years traveling the world, teaching meditation, yoga, spreading spirituality. So that begs the question: whatever got you into writing fantasy? The two. There's a little bit of an incongruency between what your day job, which is unusual by itself, and becoming a fantasy writer. However, I think it'll be intriguing for your readers to get a little insight into what inspired you to get into this, and a little bit about the genesis of this writing project.
Yeah, well, of course, I am a monk. I'm a yoga monk, but I'm also a human being with my own hobbies. And
so you are not a cephalopod, then?
I'm not a cephalopod. Even though the hero of my novel is a cephalopod.
You are not wearing a human suit.
I'm not wearing a human suit.
Okay, I just wanted to get that straight in case your readers were confusing the narrator with the author, which sometimes happens in fiction.
Right. Thank you. So I've always wanted to write a fantasy story. I read a lot of fantasy stories when I was a kid. Started off with the Narnia stories. E. Nesbit, he's a bit largely forgotten now. He wrote Five Children in It and some wonderful children's fantasy, and of course Tolkien and many more. And so I always thought it'd be great to, I used to write, essays for school when I was in primary school about dragons and monsters and draw monsters. So I was a bit obsessed with this genre for many years. I read a lot of science fiction as well. And I'm also, I've got a big passion for humor, especially Monty Python and that kind of English humor.
All right.
So they're really things that I love, and I always wanted to try and create something in that genre. But this story really started with me making up a story to entertain a little girl. And she was 2, and her name is Taruna McLean, and the book is dedicated to her. Although she's all grown up now with a child of her own, and she's a civil liberties lawyer in Australia. But I just got a message.
Has a civil liberties lawyer in Australia had a chance to read your book?
Well, she's got a copy, and she says that as soon as she gets time between being a lawyer and taking care of her baby, she'll definitely read it.
Okay.
So, yes, it's interesting if you look at this genre, like how some of the greatest books in fantasy started off as the author telling the story to a child. Alice in Wonderland,
Okay.
absolutely, and of course The Hobbit.
A rather illustrious predecessor.
Yeah, and well, even more illustrious, Tolkien started the story of The Hobbit. Started off with him telling the story to his son Christopher.
Wow. Okay.
And out of the blue, he just came up with this line. He said, "In a hole there lived a hobbit." He had no idea what the story was going to be about.
And what was the first lines that came to you when you told this story to Miranda?
I don't know. It was a game, and she was Space Nurse Miranda. She made up her own character, so she decided she was a space nurse and called herself Miranda, who's in the story. And I made up my character. I was Dr. Dogalog.
And I remember you telling me once where you got this name Dogalog from. Something to do with your mother and
really, it's pretty nuts.
Yeah, why don't you tell that story?
My parents emigrated from England to New Zealand about 5 years before I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother's father was quite a wealthy businessman, and he seemed to imagine, back in the 1950s, that New Zealand was some kind of Wild West, because we used to receive these big packages of food and clothing from England, from Harrods, of all places, which is a very upper class shopping center, can you call it, department store. And there was one particular breakfast cereal. Perhaps he thought they didn't have food in New Zealand. We used to get this breakfast cereal from England, and we loved it. And it was kind of like a kind of a toasted muesli kind of breakfast cereal, and they were called Dogalogs. Oh no, they weren't. They were called Foo Grains, but we called them Dogalogs because for some reason our mother called them Dogalogs, and I never knew why. So there's all sorts of little obscure bits of my life found their way into my story.
Well, that I think that happens with a lot of writers, that obscure bits of their life find their way into the books. But maybe we'll get back to that if we find any other interesting bits of your life that have gotten to this book. So you said that was if she was a young girl and she's now a civil liberties lawyer with babies of her own, then this was probably quite some time ago that you started telling this story.
This has been a very long process. That was it must have been 1977, I think, when I started playing this crazy game with this little girl, and that was some time ago. But now, to give you a little idea of
38 years ago, just to be, precise.
Yes. Now, it wasn't that I started writing the book then. That was just with the inception of the characters. Maybe 20 years after that, I was traveling a lot, and to entertain myself, I started writing some short stories whilst on the plane. And I started writing about this character, Dr. Dogalog and Space Nurse Miranda, and I started adopting some other characters based on some of our friends, people you know, actually. And they came into...
Yeah, wasn't Satya one of those?
Yeah, we have a good friend, Satya. He's got to be the funniest guy I know, and I have a lot of fun making fun of him in my story.
By the way, I don't know if you know, but he's decided that Tom Cruise should play him in the movie version of the book.
He didn't tell me.
I had suggested Daniel Day-Lewis. You know, he's being Irish and all, but no, he wants Tom Cruise because, well, he has his own rationale for that. But.
Well, to any aspiring writers listening to this, you know, your friends are a rich source of character building because you know them and they're real to you. So you can take them, and then what I do, of course, is distort them pretty unfairly and exaggerate them. So they're kind of caricatures of people you know, but because they are people you know, it gives it a much greater sense of them being real characters. And it's a lot of fun as well, especially when our friend Satya is threatened to sue me if I publish.
Well, I think now he's starting to get on board. You know, the fact that he can become famous one day through your book, that's starting to inspire him.
Oh, well, I'm sure Tom Cruise will be happy to oblige.
Yeah, of course. Well, we hope so.
Let me finish that. So I started writing some short stories, and then that went on for quite a few years. Just they weren't really connected. I didn't have a clear idea of a plot. And
at that time, you didn't really have an idea that you were going to turn this into a feature-length novel.
Not really. I was just kind of keeping myself entertained. Though I had a suspicion that the stories were all connected. So I thought, yeah, maybe one day, but I wasn't clear about it. But then at one point, I was very ill. I was in Malaysia, and I was in this terrible hospital because I didn't have any health. The one time I didn't buy travel insurance, I got sick. So I ended up in this government hospital, and they, without telling me, they put me on a pethidine drip. Now, pethidine is a very powerful opiate, and I haven't taken drugs since I was 20. Suddenly, I was feeling very strange. And I'm trying to meditate when I was in the hospital bed, and I remember closing my eyes and I was in this psychedelic world, and I thought, these guys have put something in the water. And it was during that time, those few days, that actually the plot of the whole story became clear, of the mission to find the Microvita seed. And yeah.
So you owe the real genesis of the book to a drug-related experience.
I'm afraid I do, but I have to plead innocence. I was a victim of some doctor who thought he stopped me complaining because I was in some pain.
Okay, well, we won't hold that against you, you being a yogic monk and all.
Thank you. But it changed a lot. That was just the inception, but that really was when the plot sort of became, you know, some sort of overall plot. And then I started actually writing it as a book, and it took a long time, longer than it should have.
About how long since that time?
I think that we're talking like 14 years or something crazy.
Since your drug-related inspiration to the time that the book was actually published.
Yeah, I think it was maybe 14 years. Which is auspicious because that's how long it took Tolkien to write the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
That is auspicious.
Well, though Tolkien, you know, rightly might have said that his book is far better than mine, though not as funny.
Well, let's pause here for a second to see what Tolkien actually did say about your book. And I have a quote right here.
Yeah.
Nowhere near as good as Lord of the Rings, but it is a lot funnier.
There you go.
So I guess that's what he thought. Yeah, his book is better than yours, but he does grudgingly admit that your book is funny.
Well, I think, I mean, from when I was sort of thinking, okay, what genre?
Math from Beyond the Grave.
Yeah, that's right. Well, he was an intuitive man.
Exactly.
But from the beginning, I was sort of thinking, okay, what genre do I want to write in? Because when I was much younger, I did start writing some serious fantasy, you know, stories, and I thought, what am I doing here? the genre's already been ruined by Tolkien long ago, because you can never, nobody's going to be right. I certainly am never going to write a fantasy novel anywhere near as good as Lord of the Rings. So why try? You don't want to compete with that guy, right? So, but he really wasn't funny. I mean, I think I can remember one joke in Lord of the Rings, and it wasn't a very good one. So I thought, okay, here's something I can do that will set me apart from the master of fantasy. So I don't have to be, measured against him.
Right. And then, and you got into seriously working on the novel about how long ago?
10 years ago. Well, no, really 8 years ago. 8 years ago. I really started writing regularly, and I started taking every winter out. I would take a month or so out, and I remember when I first went to your place, actually, and I had 2,000 pages of notes at that point, and it was kind of chaos. And I'd been told that this was too long for one book, so I was already planning to make it a trilogy, and spent a couple of weeks mapping out, really creating the whole plot that was supposed to span 3 books, which has since grown to 5.
Right. And let me just make an aside here for your readers. You are actually quite busy with your day job, and your day job is actually a 7-day-a-week job. Right? There's no time off for monks who travel the world teaching and doing all the things it is you do. Plus, you're a musician, I hear.
Yes, you know very well.
Writing, yes, I know very well. Having produced one of your CDs, writing songs, performing. So that's also, it takes a good chunk of time. So just to situate things, it's not like you were just working straight 8 years on the book. You had to be able to take a chunk of time here and a chunk of time there. And basically, that's why it took so long.
Right. It was pretty much a month a year. I would just do this.
Okay.
And then in between, most years I did very little. Though in the last year, when things were looking like nearly ended, I was really motivated to get it done. So I did manage to, find quite a bit of time to finish it. But yeah, you're right. Most of the time I was just working 1 month a year. So yeah, I don't want to discourage aspiring fantasy writers. It doesn't have to take that long if you're not totally busy doing other things.
Well, I think they'll be glad to hear that. I just wanted to go back a little bit to what you're saying about using characters from people that you know, and this seems to be a very useful technique, for getting deep in your characters. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship with your characters and how that changed over time? I mean, yes, they started based on real people, but eventually, did they take on a life of their own for you?
Yeah, definitely. If characters, for me anyway, they become kind of alive in my head. It's not really schizophrenic. It's more of a private fantasy world that you develop, which I felt. I think most writers that write in fiction pretty much have to do this, so that it's sort of real. Because if it's real to you internally, then it can be real to the reader. So you start off with somebody maybe a friend, maybe somebody you don't like, but they might be the initial template. But then you're going to start to mold, and they'll gradually become somebody perhaps quite far removed from the original actual person.
Well, I'm sure our friend Satya will be glad to hear that, since he's described as looking like a certain type of insect.
Oh yeah, well, that's just a detail.
Yeah.
He's kind of skinny and spiky, but he's not really like that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you a little bit what kind of advice you would give to aspiring writers who are interested in the fantasy genre, which is perhaps the most popular genre nowadays. What advice would you give them based on your experience over these past years writing your first novel, for how to and how not to write a fantasy epic?
Okay. It's kind of tough because it's a very busy genre. There's a huge amount of competition. So the biggest challenge is to be original. And I've seen too many pale imitations of Tolkien to want to even try and write one of those, sort of elves and dragons, serious type fantasy story. You've got to come up with something really, really different. And a few people have achieved that, of course. Quite a number of people. I think probably Ursula Le Guin's one of the most outstanding.
Right.
She has dragons. She has, this kind of wizards and magic, but her stories are fantastically original and brilliantly executed. So she's, there are a number of examples. It's possible. But so my first warning would be, steer as far as possible away from trying to write another Lord of the Rings or similar. The other thing I think is important is read a lot of fantasy, actually. Now, some people are a bit afraid of that because they think they're going to end up imitating it, but there's a kind of language of the fantasy genre. Now, in my book, I make fun of it sometimes. And I've seen other fantasy humor writers do that. But you can only do that if you really know the language of the genre. So you need to be familiar with the genre. You need to be familiar with what different things people have done. Stephen Donaldson's pretty original as well. Though I'm not a huge fan of him, but he's original. And if you step over into science fiction, you've got, of course, the great Dune. That was an amazing thing. And Le Guin is one of the few authors to have really straddled both fantasy and science fiction really effectively. And so she's remarkable in that, because most writers either are outstanding in one or the other. But there are others who are writing original fantasy, but you've got to come up with something really, really new and novel. But you can still use elements from the genre, because that's what makes it story belong in that genre. So it might be medieval type setting, it might be on this world or another world, but there's typically people are fighting with swords, not laser guns. That would make it science fiction.
Right.
So there are kind of traditions within the genre that it's fine to adopt, but just be very, very wary of imitation. What was the second part of your question, sir?
Well, advice how not to write a fantasy, not to stay away from imitation, and maybe some of the things that you've learned as far as technique, organizing your time, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, the thing I got to tell people a bit about how your role in this. So,
I was thinking a little bit. You made, from what I remember, a few errors along the way, like shifting point of view when you shouldn't.
You're on thin ice here, my friend. Okay, so point of view is a tricky thing, especially. Well, let me explain my writing background. So I've written a nonfiction book, and it's in its third edition. And during the process of writing that, I learned how to write nonfiction reasonably well. Writing fiction is something different. It's kind of like switching from classical to jazz. So it's a whole new skill that you have to learn. And the whole thing of developing a plot, it's completely different than writing a book about meditation. You're making up a story, and it's big. A novel is pretty long, at least 70,000 words. Mine's 100,000 words. It's a little long. Some are longer, but it's a very big canvas. And to keep that all in your head is pretty much impossible. So there are different techniques for mapping out your plot. I actually used physical sticky notes. I sat down and wrote every scene on sticky notes and organized them into a sequence. And I looked at ideas on the flow of the plot and the sort of beginning, middle, and end, where you want the tension to rise and fall. Once you've climax, you should basically finish it without dragging it out too long, which even some of the greatest masters have done that. But if you're a new writer, you can't break those kind of rules. You won't pull it off.
Right.
The same. So your plot, study some good mentors on the plot structure, and really learn from those, because the kind of rules or guidelines rather than rules they come up with usually make some sense. As far as point of view goes, the same applies. Point of view is tricky at best. Don't try anything experimental if you're a fairly new writer. Switching point of view and unorthodox points of view are really, really difficult to pull off. I don't feel ready for that at all, and you don't need to in this genre. You're not trying to write literary fiction. You're trying to write a story that entertains, hopefully inspires, or whatever your objective is. But you want to create a fictive dream, and the point of view is critical to that, because the reader has to feel that they're in your world. And in fantasy, that's tremendously important, because it's very much about creating a world that's a kind of alternative to the real world. So your point of view, the eyes through which your reader is going to see the story and experience the story is very, very important. So I've actually chosen 2 points of view in my story, in a sense, because it's a story within a story. And this is fairly orthodox.
What you're talking about here is you used a framing device.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And why don't you explain just briefly what your framing device is for this book?
Sure. So Dr. Dogalog is the alien cephalopod. He's traveling.
The cephalopod, for our less marine educated readers, is?
Okay. Yeah, well, not everybody knows what a cephalopod is.
Not everybody is a marine biologist.
Right. So, it's simply the family of mollusks, the subfamily of mollusks that includes octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, and nautiluses. So an alien cephalopod is your classic alien with tentacles and eye stalks and really squishy and kind of weird. So my alien cephalopod protagonist, or hero, is traveling back to Earth on his spaceship in the 20th, or in present time, you can say, roughly. Okay. Telling the story of his first journey to Earth to the little girl who's a human. She's 7 years old.
And that would be Space Nurse Miranda.
That's Space Nurse Miranda. So you open the story where he's telling her, they're talking and he's telling her the story, but most of the time it's him telling the story in the first person. So when they're in the spaceship, Dr. Dogalog said such and such, Miranda said, oh, really? So that's in the third person.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But when he's telling her the story, which is the bulk of the actual novel, you go into that world of the story that he's telling to the little girl, and you're seeing it through his eyes.
Right.
It's a little bit similar to the Never-Ending Story film.
Okay, yeah.
Similar framing. And you'll find that in some other fantasy stories where I think there's another one, is it something about a princess or something, where somebody's reading the story to the child and then you're in the story. Okay. It's a common device in this genre, and I think it's pretty friendly to this genre.
Mm-hmm. And I think also it gives you some scope for your flexibility for your future books as well.
Well, exactly, because that's this journey that they're going on takes 3 books. I mean, during that journey, he's telling the story to Miranda, and that takes up the first 3 books, and then the last 2 books is when they land on Earth, and what happens in the present day. The last parts of the story.
Now, do you already have a basic idea for what's going to happen then in each of the 5 books? Yes.
Though the further out it is, the less clear it is. So books 4 and 5 I've got bits. I've actually written the climax. There's pieces that I've written, and I've got an idea of what happens, but it's very broad, also rough. Book 2 is very clear because I've already kind of written the second draft. And then book 3, I've got quite a lot of stuff written. There's more to it, and that's going to have another point of view in a way, because that's actually probably going to be told. Well, it's at least about Lucifer, the other character, rather than about Dr. Dogalog.
Okay, and Lucifer, of course, is based on our friend Satya.
So he's Dr. Dogalog's friend, who's extremely weird.
Yeah. Yeah, curious name you gave him, Lucifer.
Yeah. Saint Lucifer is his name. It was a bit of a slip up at the Vatican. I think they forgot that one of their less respected characters shared that name.
So seeing that it took you 8 years to write the first volume of this 5-volume series, basic math tells us it's going to be 40 years before we're done. However, realistically speaking, when can we expect the next book to be out? Okay. And what's the title of the next book?
The next book's probably, the working title is The Way of the Banana. I think I like that one. Book 3 is going to be called the Detox Clinic from Hell.
Okay.
And book 4, I'm not quite sure about that one. The last one I know is called The Battle of the Orange Dog.
Right.
The title I really like. I think I'm going to, that one I'm very happy with. But I don't think it'll take 40 years because I don't really expect to be alive in 40 years' time. I'll be 100. In 40 years' time, I'll be 100 years old. I mean, it's possible. People live to 100. But I really don't think it'll take that long because what I've done in the last 8 years is not just write book 1. I actually wrote book 2 as well, up to the second draft. So that should be ready next year, in 2016. Plus, and
if I remember correctly, you were actually planning on publishing book 1 and 2 as one volume, but didn't it get too big to be published as one volume?
That's right. That's why I've written I've already written a second draft of book 2. By the time I got to the end of the second draft, I discovered this is way too long for one book. And I had a lot of trouble finding a place to divide it. But in the end, we found a natural spot, and it works well. Book 2 is already, in well advanced. Plus, during these 8 years, I was learning how to write fantasy. And that took me an awful lot of time. And that's a huge part of the job. You're learning how to write in the genre. So now that I've got some proficiency in that, then it's much, much easier for me to write the ensuing volumes.
We still won't ask your readers to hold their breath, but we can expect the next volume to be out within a reasonable length of time then.
Yeah, I think I've crossed a few deadlines, as you know. But I think we can probably have book 2 out in 2016, and then the next 3 books, who knows? But maybe one every couple of years, maybe. I hope. Depends on how many people like it. If lots of people are clamoring for more volumes, then that'll inspire me to put more energy into it.
Well, how's the response been so far?
I've got some really nice reviews. I've got 20 Amazon reviews, and they're all 5-star, except for one is 4-star. I don't know why. I think that's totally unreasonable. But a lot of very nice reviews. One of my favorites is from it's not actually on Amazon because he's never bought anything from Amazon, so he can't post a review. A very dear friend of mine, John Lowe from New Zealand. He was one of my boyhood buddies, and now he kind of, I think he kind of respects that I'm a monk and that, but he's not interested in meditation or any of this stuff. He's more pretty down to earth guy. Right. So he wrote to me, but he's pretty well. He's got a degree in English literature, so he knows something about writing, and he's quite. He pretends not to be an intellectual, but actually he's really smart. And he wrote and he said, "Look, to be honest, when I started reading the book, I had some trepidation. I was worried that it might be some kind of a sermon. I'm a monk. I'm like a religious guy, and I'm going to lay some trip on him." So he told me, he only admitted this afterwards. Said I was worried about that, but he said I was really happy that there wasn't. I didn't even smell anything like that. There was no hint that you were trying to indoctrinate me or use this story as some way to kind of influence my ideas about the meaning of life. So I was really happy to hear that because that was my objective.
It's a wonderful comment, but that's also it's curious because you are a yogic monk. Your day job is teaching meditation and propagating spirituality, universal spirituality around the planet. To what extent were you able to give a spiritual tonality to the book, and to what any spirituality that made its way into the book pre-planned or just a natural outgrowth of of you being who you are.
Well, what you just said, it should be natural. So to whatever extent the book has some spiritual kind of content or message or values built into it, I wanted it to come through as a natural product of my own mind and personality and what I like and what I don't like. So the dragon's a vegetarian, but he has to be convinced to be a vegetarian.
Right.
And the mission is a very noble one. They're trying to save the planet, and that's something, in my serious moments, that seems to me like a really, really good idea. The characters that I kind of like, whose personalities I like, they have qualities that I genuinely admire, like loyalty and courage and warmth and humor and all these things. So it is an expression of what I hold dear and all of that, but it's at the same time, it's a story. And it's firstly a story, which I want people to enjoy and be drawn into and feel something of what I felt whilst writing it, which I have to say was a tremendous amount of joy.
Well, I think the readers who read this will be able to feel that, because it's a very positive, very upbeat book, as you would hope. I mean, there are types of comic writers who are very cynical, but that's definitely not the case with your book and your writing. Just to continue a little bit more on this thread, let us say mining the hidden spiritual content in the book, the non-pre-planned natural outgrowth of you being who you are as you wrote content. Can you talk a little bit about the title? Because that's not something that most readers are going to be familiar with, Microvita.
All right.
And exactly what is the Microvita tree?
Sure. So the whole series of 5 books that's planned is called the Microvita Tree. Is that a quintuplet or what is that? I know what a trilogy is 3 books. I don't know what a 5 series is, but
I think it's just a series.
Okay, so the series of 5 books. The whole series is called the Microvita Tree. So this book, volume 1, is called Real Dragons Don't Cry. So the Microvita Tree, as you read in the synopsis, is this magical tree that well, I'll tell you a bit more about it. Only one can exist on a planet at a time. And when it matures, after about 1,000 years, when it blossoms, it releases all of this kind of positive energy, or kind of spiritual energy, which transforms the atmosphere of the whole planet and changes people, so that it kind of ushers in a spiritual age or a golden age. Okay. So obviously it could be seen as a metaphor for the advent of a great spiritual personality. That's really what it's about. Really want to know. Okay. So, the Messiah got turned into a tree. All right?
Got it. Now, was that in any way inspired or influenced by the Narnia books and what's his name? Aslan? Who was
Aslan, yeah, Aslan. Aslan the lion in
right.
He's the Jesus figure, of course, from
very thinly disguised.
Very thinly disguised. Aslan is Turkish for lion. That's where he got the name from.
Okay.
So yeah, he's very obviously that's an allegory. If you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then you read the New Testament, it's the same story.
Okay.
And when I was my older brother, who pointed this out to me when I guess I was 8 or something, and I hadn't twigged to it, but he's older than me and smarter, so he said, "Oh yeah, this is just the same story as the Bible." Now at that point, I didn't really like Christianity, and I felt that I'd been deceived, and I really didn't like that. And so when I was reading something of Tolkien's work, he wrote a book called I think it's called On the Writing of Fairy Stories or something like that, a famous essay that he wrote. He was actually indirectly critical of C.S. Lewis and his allegorical Narnia stories. I mean, he didn't name C.S. Lewis. They were very close friends. But right. Actually, he was criticizing C.S. Lewis, if you read it closely. He said, "I have a cordial dislike of allegory in all its forms." Because he was making the case for The Lord of the Rings not being an allegory.
Right.
many people were arguing, they'd try and say, what is Lord of the Rings really about? Is it about the Second World War? Does the ring represent the atomic bomb? And Tolkien pointed out that this, even if that was true, it makes no sense. If it had been an allegory like that, then it would have been told very differently. And he also made it very clear. He said, look, there's a difference between applicability and allegory. An allegory is like just changing the names, basically, and telling the same story. Whereas applicability is taking human nature and saying, yeah, okay, people behave like this in real life. They also behave like this in my story. So there are, of course, going to be many situations that are applicable to real life, but it's a story that stands on its own. And of course, he does draw on tradition. The Numenor story is Atlantis,
okay,
which is part of the backstory of Lord of the Rings, if you
right.
look into that. So he does draw on tradition, and he was probably the #1 expert in the world on a lot of those kind of old stories. So I'm very much an admirer of Tolkien, as you can probably tell. I really like his perspective on that and his approach. I didn't want my story to be really an allegory. I just wanted it to be something that stood on its own. But yeah, you can apply some of the things, and there are metaphors and a few parallels. But it's a unique story.
And I guess that's why your buddy was quite happy with the book, because it really clearly didn't come across as in any way as being preaching or having some type of hidden agenda.
Exactly. And you asked why a monk might write a story like this. Partly I do it because I couldn't not do this. It was inside me, and I felt like I had to I don't know, feel that I'd fulfilled what I'm supposed to do in this life, as strange as that may sound. Also, but I think it has some functionality. I want part of my mission, if you like, in life is to help people to understand that spirituality isn't something that's separate from what we do every day. It needs, to lead a spiritual life means to integrate your values and beliefs into your everyday activities, and that's the spirit of the tradition of Tantra Yoga that I come from. So for me, I have since childhood, as I said, I have a passion for fantasy stories, writing, and later humor writing. I felt like I didn't want to suppress that. That's part of me, and I've found a way to express that I think is constructive. And I think, in a way, I think it might inspire people about some of the spiritual ideas that I believe in. The dragon does meditation. He's not very good at it, but he tries.
Well, one thing that really came across in the book, other than the obvious, having an interesting plot and interesting characters, was just the overall positivity of the book. They go through some danger. You've got crisis and all this stuff, but there's a kind of general sense of positivity and optimism, and I think that does come from the author himself.
Well, our spiritual master, Sri Nandamurti, he always said that one of the qualities that we should try and develop as a spiritual aspirant is optimism. And he always said that he's an optimist, and that he reflected that in his life. And so I try to do that, and certainly I'd say that's something I really wanted to express through the story, because I think cynicism is very dangerous. And you mentioned that even humor writers are sometimes quite cynical. And I think that's not going to help us. I think we need to engender hope and optimism, because I don't think it's very useful being a pessimist. It's crippling, actually. It's
but individually and collectively.
Yeah, and that can have serious consequences. So,
well, that's good. I think we need more books that are fundamentally uplifting. It's great that we have books we can laugh. This is a book that I think most readers are going to find quite humorous. But it's nice, there's a lot of nowadays some darker types of fantasy novels have become very popular. You have post-apocalyptic literature and dark fantasy and these kind of things. And it seems to be, you know, very attractive for young people growing up in a world where oftentimes the outlook looks very bleak. So I think your book serves in a certain respect as an antidote to that, and to keep a positive vision, you know, out there for its readers. And I think it's very healthy.
Well, fairly recently there was a conference of science fiction writers, and this question was raised, which was, you know, yeah, there's a lot of dystopian, or, you know, the opposite of utopian novels out there, and they're particularly popular amongst young adults. And they sort of raised the question: well, if all these, you know, millions of young adults are believing, or sort of anticipating that the world is going to become, you know, a terrible place, like in the Hunger Games or something like that,
right.
Maybe that will be a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree. So it could be very serious. And many of the writers at that conference actually took a decision to change, at least write one book each, I think they decided, that had a much more optimistic, positive outlook for the future, because they were concerned about their responsibility to the public and the influence they might be having on the minds of millions of readers.
And the basic overriding vision, as you mentioned, of the Microvita Tree is that the goal is to flood the world with spiritual, enlightening energy.
Yeah, or to enable that, you know, that the tree is the means for that, but to protect the tree, to plant it, protect it, and nurture it, and allow that to happen.
Maybe that in a way is our goal. As human society, as a human race, to fill the world with that bright, positive, spiritual energy.
Well, yeah, that's what I guess we're trying to do in meditation. And, you know, when we get together and meditate in a group or chant and we create spiritual music, all of that is generating positive Microvita, which is kind of what the story's about.
Right, and Microvita being that spiritual energy.
Yeah.
Or as the Beach Boys used to say, good vibrations.
Oh, yeah, great song.
Well, I think our time's just about up. So why don't we end on this note? Unless there's anything more you want to add, anything more you want to say to your readers.
Oh no, we'll probably, you know, we could revisit this whole thing from a different perspective, but I think this has been a really nice opportunity to give readers or potential readers a little bit of a deeper insight into what's, you know, the story behind the story, why I wrote this book, what it kind of means to me, and what I want people to get out of it. So thanks a lot for probing me so pleasantly. I want to just say something at the end about you, because my friend David Sheesh, to those of you who don't know him, is a very prolific author. He doesn't take 14 years to write a book. He has written, I believe, is it 7 books?
Yeah, 7 or 8 books, right? Yeah.
Arguably better written than mine, but not nearly as funny. And
that's true. In that respect, and in only that respect, you can put me on a par with Tolkien.
Well, that's why he's my editor, because he's a more skilled writer than me. But I actually want to interview you, David Sheesh, at some point in the future about your books, because you know, you also write spiritual fiction as well as nonfiction, and I really would love our readers and listeners to get a chance to learn more about them and why you do that, what messages you might be trying to bring to the world through your writing.
That will be fun. I finished my most recent novel, so that should be coming out soon. Maybe that'll be a good opportunity.
Real time with promotion. Excellent.
Yeah. Cool.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me, and we'll see each other again soon.
As always, it was a pleasure. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
Okay, so